Could the rapture be in 2021? In another video linked here, we've considered the possibility of the rapture occurring in October. But what's so special about 2021? The simple answer is 1948. The more involved answer is the year of Christ's death, 1948, the Jewish calendar, the missing years, the population of the earth, and a week as a model of human history. Let's start with 1948. Why are there no modern Hittites or Amorites or Moabites? In ancient times, when a nation was conquered, it was common that the survivors almost invariably intermarried, and the nation itself was utterly destroyed. So, why are there Jews still as a nation? No matter what your view of history, it cannot be denied that Israel coming back as a nation has no parallel throughout all time. They have been dispersed throughout the world for nearly 2,000 years, and then they came back as an actual nation-state in 1948. So what happened to the Jews? If you don't follow history, it will be hard for you to understand how incredible it is that there is a nation of Israel at all in modern times. To understand it, consider the following. In 70 AD, the Second Temple was destroyed. Clearly, when Jesus talks about the destruction of the temple in Mark 13:2, he's referring to that event. The destruction at that time was severe. The historian Josephus recorded that over 1 million Jews were killed in the siege. Others were enslaved or fled to areas around the Mediterranean. However, Israel as a nation was not yet destroyed. In the 130s AD, Simon Bar Kokhba led a revolt against the Romans. It was completely crushed in 136 AD. The historian Cassius Dio states that about 580,000 Jews were killed, and it led to the desolation of the Jewish population. To destroy the Jewish faith, the Emperor Hadrian executed Jewish scholars and prohibited the Torah and the Hebrew calendar. Attempting to completely erase Jewish history, he renamed the province of Judah to Syria-Palestina, the origin of the term Palestine. The whole nation was prohibited from going up to the country around Jerusalem, and that was the end of Israel as a nation-state in the past. But that's not all. In the 1940s, we find that the Jews themselves, those scattered throughout the nations, had not disappeared. That in itself is astounding. How could that be? From 1941 to 1945, Hitler literally tried to exterminate the Jews, killing approximately 6 million in his great assertion of evolutionary superiority. In addition, with the coming of Jesus, some Christians believe that the church replaces Israel, as if the Jewish people have no further part to play in God's plan. Given all these things, there's no logical reason to believe that there should be any nation of Israel. What does Romans 11 say? 11:1 says, I ask then, did God reject his people? By no means. Verse 25 says, I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers and sisters, so that you may not be conceited. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. Verse 29 says, For God's gifts and his call are irrevocable. May 14, 1948. Everything I've mentioned about the history of the Jews since the time of Jesus has been intended to give you a sense of how incredible May 14th, 1948 is. That's when Israel became a nation again. As people, we have a strong tendency to explain things away without really thinking about them and paying attention. However, the destruction of the Jewish people in 70 AD and 136 AD was so complete that today, Googling information on Israel as a nation, you're likely to get the impression that Israel became a nation in 1948 only. In fact, even pastors refer to the land as Palestine as if it's not really Israel. But my question is, would you have predicted it? Perhaps in the 1940s you would have. Maybe even in early the 1900s. But that's not a real prediction. That's just observing what God was already doing. The question is, would you have predicted it in 136 AD. Only if you paid close attention to God's Word. He predicted it in Romans in 57 AD. So let's look at Mark 13:28 through 30. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see these things happening, you know that it's near, right at the door. Truly, I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. If there's ever been a sign that God is doing something in our time, May 14th, 1948 may be it. So what does 1948 have to do with 2021? That's a great question. I have known for a long time that 1948 was a clear indication of God at work with the Jews. But as I recently started looking at it relative to 2021, I was shocked. There are a number of amazing correlations. This means that there's not just one line of evidence, but multiple lines that all link up in a way that I wouldn't have expected until I looked at them all together. There's so much information, in fact, that it's hard to condense and still make it understandable and informative. I'll do the best I can and create other videos if appropriate. The issue that started me thinking about 2021 was the length of a generation and Daniel chapter 9. However, it now seems to me that the date of Christ's death is the real key. That makes a ton of sense to me. After all, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ is the central point of human history. It seems to me to be very likely that the end of this phase of human history will occur literally 2,000 years after the death of Christ. That's not just picking a number out of the air. We'll look at that in a little bit. That does imply that I currently think that 28 AD is a strong candidate for the year of Christ's death. Initially, I thought that that wasn't likely. However, after further study, I think it's actually a very good candidate. Since there are so many lines of reasoning that align, we could explore them in any order. I'm going to present them in an order that I took, but if you're doing your own study, you can explore them in any other order if you'd like. Let's look at Mark 13:28 through 30. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see these things happening, you know that it is near, right at the door. Truly, I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. So, what's a generation? That's a great question. I won't be dogmatic, but consider this. Psalm 90:10a. Our lives last 70 years, or if we're strong, 80 years. If a generation is 80 years at most, and Israel is the fig tree of Mark 13:28, then we find that the generation starting with Israel's birth ends in 2028. Again, I'm not saying 2028 is the fulfillment of Mark 13:30. I'm saying it's a possible interpretation that came to my attention. In any case, if your view is amillennial, you may have about 7 more years left. But for all you pre-trib people, that takes us to Daniel chapter 9. Daniel 9:27 describes the 70 weeks. I won't read it all for lack of time, but the key points are, when Daniel mentions weeks, he really means years because he's using a Shemitah pattern. It's spelled a number of different ways, but it's basically a pattern of 6 regular periods and 1 rest period. This is because of the pattern that God established at creation. The prophecy says that 70 weeks were decreed to end sin. 69 of those weeks were clearly fulfilled and ended exactly on the year of the triumphal entry, crucifixion, ascension, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus. The last week is the 7-year covenant, which leads us to the idea of the 7-year tribulation. So now you know why 2021 is a key date to consider. 2028 minus 7 is 2021. But what if a generation is longer than 90 years? Or what if 1948 was not the start of these things in Mark 13:29? That's a great question. If these things are true, I should be able to follow independent lines of evidence that lead me to the same conclusion. To understand a lot of what we're talking about, you need to understand the pattern of the week. Why? Because it's found in God's command of the feasts. In a separate video, I describe the importance of the feasts. In Leviticus 23:3, it says, "Work may be done for 6 days, but on the 7th day there must be a Sabbath of complete rest, a sacred assembly. You are not to do any work. It is a Sabbath to the Lord wherever you live." The week pattern of 6 work and 1 rest is what is meant by Daniel's weeks or sevens. It's a pattern God established in creation. There are reasons in astronomy for months and years, but not for the week. That was defined for us by God. It is why God speaks of us entering into his rest. Daniel, in his prophecy, uses this same pattern, but each day is actually a year, so a week or a 7 is 7 years. The pattern of the week is a very important pattern in the Bible. Just do a search in the Bible for the phrase 6 days or 6 years, and you'll see it. You will also see the pattern of the week in human history itself. So now let's stop for a second. How old do you think that the earth is? A direct reading of the Bible puts it at approximately 6,000 years. Now, if you're an old earth believer, it's irrelevant because the point that we're discussing relates to God's interaction with man. So the measurement of years we're discussing is based on the history starting with Adam. So biblically, the current year is close to 6,000 years. This is how the Jewish calendar tracks time. So let's look at 2 Peter 3, 8, and 9. Dear friends, don't let this one thing escape you. With the Lord, 1 day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years like 1 day. The Lord does not delay his promise, as some understand delay, but is patient with you, not wanting any to perish, but all to come to repentance. This is, of course, a general statement that God is not bound to our timetable. That's something to keep in mind as we consider these things. But we are currently extremely close to the end of the 6,000 years of a 7,000-year week pattern. Recall that the 7th period is always a period of rest. In a millennial view, the millennial kingdom is 1,000 years of rest, where God is literally with us. In an amillennial view, we'll enter directly into the final rest of God. In either case, we're almost exactly at the end of a 6 1,000-year periods of cursed work. Do you remember Genesis 3:17? I mentioned that the Jewish calendar tracks biblical history. Well, how close are we to 6,000 according to their dating? We can kind of guess at this by thinking about what year it is. 2021 is almost 2000. It's just a little bit off. But if God is really using the week pattern in human history, we shouldn't settle for it being a little off, as if he doesn't know how to do math. However, Daniel's prophecy doesn't point to Christ's birth, but to his triumphal entry. Of course, that's the same year as his crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension. That's the focal point of history. Hold on to that thought, we'll come back to it. If we look at the current Jewish calendar, the year has just changed, because of the new year, to 5782. Bummer. That's kind of close to 6,000, but not as close as I seem to be implying. So either we're not as close to the return of Christ, or the week pattern doesn't apply, or the Jewish calendar is off, which it is. Even Jewish scholars acknowledge there are missing years in the Jewish calendar. Let's see that. To convert our year, we use the Gregorian calendar. To the Jewish year, they note it as AM for Anno Mundi, which means the year of the world, since creation, if you will. We have to add 3,760 years to our year for all dates after Jesus. However, we have to add 3,924 years for all dates before Jesus. Just search for any BC and AD dates in Anno Mundi. You'll see the difference. However, do be aware that dates you find might be off by a year or two because of the difficulty of historical dating and the fact that the Gregorian New Year and the Jewish New Year are not on the same day. The point is that 164 years went missing right at the time of Jesus. Is that a coincidence? So when did Jesus die? If you search for the year that Jesus died in Anno Mundi, you'll likely find it stated that he died on 33 AD or 3793 Anno Mundi AM. However, note that 33 AD is only one of the possible years that scholars think Jesus may have died. I'll have a separate video on that. In addition, note that Anno Mundi date given does not account for the known missing years. So if the ancient dates are right, 3793 cannot be the right date for the death of Jesus in Anno Mundi. So let's use the earlier conversion factor to see what date we get for Jesus' death if the 164 years hadn't mysteriously gone missing. If 33 AD is the year that Jesus died, then that is 3957 AM Anno Mundi. This is almost exactly 4,000 years AM. That's only off by 43 years. I've been saying that I think it's quite possible that Jesus died in 28 AD. This is still almost exactly 4,000 AM, only off by 48 years. This, of course, means that 2021 AD is, from a biblical perspective, almost exactly 6,000 years since creation. So here's the really important point that I'd like you to think about and consider for the next few minutes. If we account for the known missing years, Christ's death is almost exactly at 4,000 years since creation. The rebirth or resurrection of Israel, if you will, plus a generation of 80 years is almost exactly at 6,000 years. In all cases, the difference is less than 50 years. So here's the question. What's the most reasonable explanation for that? Is the difference a coincidence? They're close, but not right. Or is it human error? Let's look a little bit more at the idea of coincidence. At this point, I'm not going to try to prove anything. I'm just going to list some things and let you consider. Do you think these are coincidences? And in fact, is there such thing as a coincidence in God's timing? We've already mentioned that based upon the week pattern, we are literally, not figuratively, almost exactly at the end of the millennial 6 days of work. That's shown at the top of the graph above. Notice that you've got 6,000 years followed by 1,000 years. Now let's look at Galatians 4:4a. But when the fullness of time came, God sent forth His Son. Was God just waiting on history to get to some point and reacting to it? Or was there a specific timing planned by God from eternity past? I've been told that the number 4 represents earthly, 3 represents heavenly, and 7 represents completeness. Perhaps that's true, perhaps not, but it seems to align perfectly with human history. Is it a coincidence that in the fullness of time, Jesus Christ came 4,000 years after creation? 2,000 years before the resurrection of Israel, and if the millennial kingdom is true, 3,000 years before the new heaven and earth. Note that this is exactly between earthly and heavenly. 4,000 years before Christ and 3,000 years after. 2,000 of them spiritually and 1,000 of them literally. I'm going to stop the video here. In conclusion, I'm going to propose for your consideration that the differences that we see between the dating of the Jewish calendar and the death, burial, and resurrection of ascension of Christ are a result of human errors, not coincidence. That Jesus literally died exactly 4,000 years after creation, whatever that date turns out to be on the Gregorian calendar. I'm going to further propose that it's no accident that Israel became a nation in our time, and we are literally almost exactly 6,000 years after creation, marking the end of 6 periods of human history of work and the beginning of the period of rest on earth where God is reigning. So the real question is, when did Jesus actually die? If Jesus died in 28 AD, then 2028 will mark exactly 6,000 years since creation. A final thing that I'll mention in this video is pre-trib, mid-trib, and post-tribulation. I've of course been looking into this a lot recently. If pre-trib is not true, then 2028 could still be the end of this period of history, but we may be going through a part or all of the tribulation. And even if you're a-mill or post-mill, it should be clear that we're living in a very interesting time in history. Let's all pray that God's will be done, no matter what we may think or want.